The Gateway brings you the day's news each weekday from around the St. Louis region and the state capitals in Jefferson City.
Our schools are accredited. We don't need this bill.
And Springfield.
How many more years must pass before lawmakers see time is of the essence?
I'm Abby Larico. Join me each weekday for The Gateway on the STLPR app or wherever you get podcasts.
From St. Louis Public Radio, this is Politically Speaking.
Missouri lawmakers are getting closer to finishing the budgetary process, and there's a lot of disagreement within the House between Republicans and Democrats over what the state's financial priorities should be. On the latest episode of Politically Speaking, Democratic State Representative Maggie Nurrenbern of Clay County talks about where her party believes the state should be spending money, and she also talks about key education bills that are moving through the legislature. Let's hit the music.
This is the Politically Speaking podcast, the definitive show about Missouri politics.
My promise to St. Louis was that I would do the absolute most for each and every person, starting with those who have the very least.
What I wanted to do was look and see what other states are doing.
We have to be willing to change those laws, that they are balanced and they affect everybody equally.
As somebody that grew up in the St. Louis area, in North St. Louis County, I didn't know any lawyers growing up.
We got to find long-term solutions to make government better, but also to be able to provide services to people.
I don't want to leave that federal money that we've been leaving all these years on the table.
We need to be spending this money to take care of Missourians.
I thought we accomplished a lot this year, but a lot more needs to be done.
And welcome to Politically Speaking. I'm your host, St. Louis Public Radio's Jason Rosenbaum. Joining me in Jefferson City, she covers state government and politics for St. Louis Public Radio.
Sarah Kellogg.
And a first-time guest representing the 15th House District, which takes in a portion of scenic and beautiful Clay County, Missouri. Our guest today is
Maggie Nurrenbern.
Thank you so much for joining us. Before we dive into the many issues that are gripping the Missouri legislature, tell us a little bit about yourself, how you got involved in politics, and kind of what you were doing before you decided to enter this wild and wacky world of the Missouri legislature.
Wild and wacky it is. Well, I am just starting my third session, or I guess halfway through my third session. I decided to get into politics, honestly, after just watching what was happening here and feeling like I was sitting on the sidelines and not able to really advocate for my family, for my students, for public education in the way that I wanted to. So I actually got my start as an intern in the Senate back in 2006. I interned for Senator Chuck Gross, who those who are familiar with your show probably remember Chuck well. He was chair of Appropriations Committee. And I continued to, follow Missouri politics closely as I decided that I didn't want to enter this world and went into the classroom and decided to be a teacher. So I was able to teach for 13 years. I served in the Peace Corps for a couple of years in Ecuador. I am very proud to be a mom of 3 kids and have 3 young boys. So they keep me very active. And I feel like it's great training to being here in the State House. I've really enjoyed this work. It's tough. It's a roller coaster at all times, but I feel like honestly, between being a high school teacher and a mom to 3 kids, I'm well equipped to handle the chaos and madness that comes our way.
So Clay County, I think, has become more Democratic in recent years.
Yeah, it sure has.
There's a Democratic state senator. There are multiple state representatives. Why do you think that there has been a shift? Because when you were interning in the Senate in 2006, the state senator, Luann Ridgway, was a Republican, and that seat was not especially competitive up until, Lauren Arthur won the special election. What do you think happened there?
And, I honestly would say just because Ryan Sylvie was in that spot before her, we probably could have flipped it before that even, but he was, definitely a moderate. When you look around our community, we are kind of the epitome of the growing, just middle class, working class families. And Clay County's, I'm from Clay County. I went to Smithville Public Schools, K-12. And I see the kind of the same values that I grew up with, the same values that surround me today and the community around us today. And I don't honestly think a lot has changed. I think what's changed is where in kind of the political shift of the Republican Party. And so that's the thing that I think is striking. We are and continue to be, I represent a fairly 50-50 district. And again, we want moderation. And people around my area are just tired of the extremism and the extreme rhetoric that they're seeing in Jefferson City. And so, I give, incredible credit to Lauren for flipping that seat. She worked very hard in that special election. And has done a tremendous job, and she certainly helped elect those of us in the state house. So I think that there has been, we certainly have benefited from her leadership over on the Senate side, and I think it's helped us win those state house races as well.
You're in the middle of your third session, as you kind of said. What have been your general impressions of the Missouri House so far?
Well, what I can say is that I feel like this year, and certainly starting off, I was very happy just to see the change in dynamic in the House leadership. I think anybody who followed, and certainly my first term, the palpable tension between Republican leadership created just a very tense environment, I think, for everybody, not just in the Republican caucus, but certainly for us as well. And I served, I'm on my third year now serving on the House Elementary and Secondary Education Committee. And you could even see how that committee was run under former State Rep Chuck Basie. And there was just such a negative vibe and really attacks against everything related to public education. So you go from that shift to now, and I feel like there is some better communication, certainly from House leadership this year. But again, I think there is that push to bring some bipartisan legislation forward. And I've been really fortunate to work on some of that. And honestly, this year under now Brad Pollitt as committee chair, we've actually talked about some good education bills. So that's been really, I've been very happy to see that. It's a roller coaster. Every year's a roller coaster. There's always different things that, that are at the forefront. But overall, like I say, I've been very happy to be here. And I'm even more happy this year, feeling like I'm actually able to work on some substantial policy as well and move that forward.
Yeah, there were expectations at the beginning of session that the leaders of the House would conduct business in a less acrimonious way. And it seems that prediction's come true, you think?
For the most part, there certainly have been plenty of tension, even right now, surrounding the controversies with the language that Doug Ritchie added to every single budget bill that was against diversity, equity, inclusion. And so we've certainly had our hiccups along the way, right? I think especially on House Bill 300 and some of the previous motions that were raised, there certainly have been hiccups. I don't want to say that, but I'd say in general, I've been very pleased with the increased communication and just the spirit of making sure if the minority party wants to weigh in, that we do have a way and our voices are heard.
And we're going to get to that language. Don't worry. But kind of speaking of, you are on the House Budget Committee. What were your impressions about how Republicans handled this process in the House so far?
Well, it was very interesting to be probably during the State of the State speech to be some of the first to go to our feet and applaud the governor's really, I felt like, very strategic plans to invest long-term in Missouri. And so we continue, to have and try to look strategically at all the federal funds and how we can make those long-term investments. And so I was very pleased in his plans to really examine how we are investing in early childhood education as well. So both through supporting increases to the child care subsidies, but also that expanded pre-K. So I was very pleased to see all of those recommendations. And then to go into the House Budget Committee and over again hear that we simply do not want to spend these funds this way, that this isn't the government's role, even though study after study just shows the incredible return on investment, if nothing else, in investing early in kids. And we know that those are the most important years of their life. Obviously, there's a lot of finger pointing about how well students are doing or not doing in the state of Missouri right now. And I think those criticisms are fair. However, we have got to look at the lack of investments in education. And I think all of that, it's a direct line of correlation.
Another thing that I think was noticeable about the House budgetary process is that House Budget Chairman Cody Smith took out, I think, about $860 million that Parson wanted for I-70 and took it completely out of the main budget bills. He says he's going to put it into a separate budget bill, but I think that money for I-70 is going to get reduced because a lot of Southwest Missouri lawmakers want general revenue to help I-44.
Yeah, and I was really shocked to see that. I think over and over again, everybody understands that I-70 as the major corridor through our state, we have to invest in it. And we are going to lose jobs in Kansas City and Columbia and St. Louis if we don't do that. The congestion there is just unbelievable. Obviously, those of us who travel that know the frustrations and honestly the dangers of what we experience and we see Missourians experience every day because we have not invested in that road. And so, I remain hopeful that over on the Senate side, that they're going to be the voice of reason and kind of the adults in the room and make sure that we're making those historic investments. But we'll have to wait and see. We're still have several weeks in this process. We'll see what happens.
So kind of speaking of the Senate, Senator Lincoln Huff has said not only does he want to restore that money for I-70, he also wants to go above and beyond what the governor recommends and invest that money in I-44. He's told me that himself. Thoughts on that decision, not only for I-70, but also 44?
Absolutely. I think the plans have been out there for quite some time, and I think we should. Again, when we look at how much money is in the state treasury, yesterday I was taking a look, and we had about $17 billion sitting there. Obviously, a lot of those are earmarked for different reasons, but still the amount of general revenue we have and the amount of revenue that we can pull down from all the federal infrastructure funds as well. And so I think the time is now. If we're not making these investments now, Missouri will lose out on jobs. And, I think that's what it all boils down to. So a lot of times when I'm looking at these things, I have to ask myself, if not now, when? And never again are we going to see this amount of revenue. And I'm grateful that, Senator Huff is willing and eager to make those historic investments in the state.
So let's get back to what you were referring to earlier. The move that made the most headlines last week was when Representative Ritchie, who is, I believe, also from Clay County, although
Sure is, yeah.
a vastly more Republican part of Clay County, he put amendments forward that would bar any state funding going towards staffing, vendors, consultants, or programs associated with diversity, equity, and inclusion. Why were Democrats so opposed to what Representative Ritchie was trying to do?
Well, for numerous reasons. First of all, none of the language was ever vetted in committee. And I think that was what was so problematic about it, is that we actually didn't understand fully the impact to all of our state departments, agencies, all the contracts that we hold in the state, right? And so any change that is that substantial to not vet in a public hearing, I find troubling and problematic. Now, obviously, Representative Ritchie and others, the extreme conservatives have on their priority an absolute attack on anything that they consider woke right now. So this war on woke now is going after everything from obviously K-12 for some time that we're indoctrinating children, to higher education now, to what can and can't be taught in medical school and other healthcare related professional studies. It has been troubling to say the least. And my big concern with his attacks specifically on diversity, equity, and inclusion is that this is some of the most important work that we're doing today in the state. My belief, and obviously being an educator for 13 years, I worked in very different settings. I worked, in the inner city and for 5 years at one of our charter schools in Kansas City, one of the most segregated schools in the state. It was about 95% African-American. I grew up in a very segregated white community up in Smithville. And then I live and taught in a community that's one of the most diverse communities in the state. So North Kansas City High School is the most ethnically, racially, and socioeconomically diverse high school in the entire state, right? So I recognize how important this work is to make sure that everybody feels included, welcomed in that learning environment. When we expand that statewide, I believe that this is the work that builds a better Missouri. Diversity, equity, and inclusion builds a better Missouri by making sure everybody has a place, everybody has a voice here. And that's what I see, obviously is so important. But I think some of my Democratic colleagues, specifically my colleagues in the Black Caucus, said it the best last week, and obviously very powerful moments on the floor.
So interestingly, someone sent me a tweet a couple of days ago about how the Department of Social Services was engaging in civil rights and diversity training. And I'm going to put my tinfoil hat on for a second. Robert Nodell, who's the acting director of DSS, is a very astute political person. He used to run campaigns for Republicans. It doesn't seem like that was an accident, and it signals to me that Governor Parson is not on board with what Representative Ritchie wants to do. So am I a conspiracy theorist here, or am I on to something?
No, I think you're spot on. And, Director Adele was one of them that expressed some very grave concerns about the implications of this. I think he was one of the first that really started coming forward and recognizing how dangerous this language really was. I thought it was interesting as well. There was a tweet about essentially some sort of diversity program happening within youth services as well that I saw that was shared. I mean, over and over again, it doesn't matter what facet of government, every facet is recognizing the importance of making sure that everybody is included, that everybody's valued. And that's what I see is so important about this work.
Another big change that you've spoken a lot about was the removal of state funding for public libraries. I just kind of want your overall thoughts on this move. I'm sure I'll have a follow-up.
Well, as I said last week, I thought it was interesting that, I sit on that subcommittee for general administrations, and that money currently is housed within the Secretary of State. So we heard these budgets. Not once did a single member of that subcommittee, not once did a single member of the big budget committee ever express the desire to put forth an amendment to strip public funding, state aid to our public libraries. And, it was with one fell swoop, essentially, that budget chair, Cody Smith, decided to remove all state aid to public libraries. And I, obviously, as a big fan of public libraries, this was something that I took quite personally, just because I recognize the value in my own family for my own kids. But more importantly, in our rural communities, especially, public libraries is the one gathering spot. It's the one spot where folks can get access to, high-speed internet, and they can apply for jobs. They can seek out resources to better themselves. And that impact, that cut to the state aid is going to impact the rural communities much more than my own community. And so I, again, am thankful that we have a state Senate that I am very confident that full funding will be restored.
And Smith cited the lawsuit that is going on the bill that is causing libraries to pull off the shelves, many calling it a book ban. There's this DEI language. Last year, there was the language regarding vaccine.
COVID mitigation.
Yes. And so it just seems, and maybe you can talk on this, why do you feel like there's maybe a little bit more legislating within the budget than have been maybe in years past?
Well, I feel when there's 163 House members and voices get drowned out, quite frequently just because of our sheer number, I think those who are on the far right recognize that the budget is the place to make their voices heard. And they've decided that is the tool they are going to use, that they are going to legislate through the budget. Again, just over the last couple of years, and I'm new as a member of this body, but what we keep seeing is that essentially it's the Senate writing the budget because the House fails to do so. And we spend so much time on these culture war wedge issues and not actually talking about the real money. I mean, so much of our time on the state budget was not spent talking about how we're investing state resources. It was talking about this war on woke. And it's so frustrating because I really wanted to talk about what we can do again to make historic investments in not just our state, but in Missourians, in our state workers, and making sure that we really are moving Missouri forward. We failed to do that in the House Budget Committee and certainly on the floor as we were amending those budget bills.
Either through what Senator Huff has told me or told other outlets, there is an indication that the Senate is going to reverse a lot of what the House did. And, this happened last year, too. A lot of times, I repeatedly, then Appropriation Chair Hageman would say, Governor over House, repeatedly, but by passing stingier budgets, is the House essentially abdicating power over the budget to the Senate?
That's certainly what it seems like. And, historically, the House, the budget starts in the House, and the House really it has the first go at it. This isn't happening anymore. Again, we are spending so much of our time really diverting our time in talking about these ridiculous issues instead of talking about the state budget. And so I'm thankful for the leadership of Senator Huff on this. I think he really is going to restore all the cuts and really go back to the governor's plan. And it's interesting being a Democrat advocating for a conservative governor's budget plan, but that's the state we find ourselves in right now. And I think even the governor's plan, I really think that we can do more in a lot of areas, both in infrastructure, in early childhood, and just social services as well, and increasing specifically state pay for those workers who are really on the front lines and some of the toughest jobs in the state, for example, and direct care providers. So I'm hopeful that the Senate will even go above and beyond. Again, we're sitting on a lot of money, a historic amount of money in the Treasury right now. And I go back to, if not now, when?
We'll be right back after this quick break with State Representative Maggie Nurrenbern. And we're back on Politically Speaking with State Representative Maggie Nurrenbern. She is a Democrat from Clay County representing the 15th District in the Missouri House. So let's talk about education. That seems to be your wheelhouse because I guess in a prior life, as you mentioned before, you were a teacher. What are your thoughts about the open enrollment bill that passed the House? Sarah, if I'm not mistaken, the bill was heard in the Senate. What's kind of your thoughts about that legislation?
Well, first of all, what I respect about Brad Pollitt is that he actually has experience in this area, right? He worked 3 decades in public education and as a superintendent for Sedalia schools as well. So Brad has done a really, I commend him in really listening to a lot of our concerns and incorporating those concerns into his legislation. And as he would say, his bill today is like nothing that he originally drafted. However, I think open enrollment is wrong for Missouri because even with the changes that we've made to this legislation, if passed, this would continue to segregate schools and communities by race, by class, and by ability.
What do you make of the argument that if you happen to live within the geographical boundaries of a school district which is not performing well, you should have the ability to send your child to a school that is performing better that's close by? I mean, that's the entire philosophical argument behind this. And and I got to be honest, it's a pretty compelling argument when it's in a vacuum like that.
Okay, but in my response to that is, but what happens when all of that money follows the student? What happens to the rest of the kids that are left in that district? And that continues to be my concern about this, is that the only families that are going to be able to navigate this additional level of bureaucracy are going to be those that already have the resources and the means to move their kids or send their kids to private schools if they wish. And so those who are going to be most adversely affected by this are those who already are struggling. And so I think one of the fundamental flaws with this piece of legislation is that the state portion will follow the kid, and school systems that are doing well today are going to continue to do well. But those who have been struggling, and those and I'm not talking about just our urban schools who've been struggling. I'm really talking about some of our smallest rural schools as well. They will not be able to keep their doors open. This absolutely will cause consolidation. This absolutely will adversely affect those in the urban core who are really trying their best to make sure that they have the resources to educate students well. And I have seen this from our charter schools, and now we have over 20 years of data on how our charter schools have been doing. And we can look at the families that are in those schools and in those systems. It's the families that can navigate that level of bureaucracy. There's an incredible level of bureaucracy in that you have to apply early, you got to get in all your paperwork, et cetera, et cetera. Again, it's only those families that have the resources to do that are going to do that.
And I think you kind of alluded to this earlier. It's pretty clear that a lot of public schools, and I would say schools of all performances, have been struggling over the last year or two as they get out of the COVID-19 pandemic. I think that's not only seen in the data, but as a father of 3 kids, including 2 that go to public schools, I've heard all sorts of anecdotal evidence that kids are having a really difficult time readjusting to going back to in-person schooling. So separated from the open enrollment question, what would you want to see the state do to kind of normalize the situation at these school districts and get into a place where it's more like 2019, 2018, and not in this post-COVID world that we're in right now?
Well, first of all, I think we do have to look at our investments in public education. And, Republicans love to say that they've been fully funding education. But when we look at how much money we're putting into public education today in the formula versus 2006, we are actually adjusted for inflation investing at levels less than 2006. So you think about all the challenges that we've had. I think we're up to 25% now of our school districts in the state are on a 4-day week. How is that good for kids? And how is that good for kids' learning, achievement, and growth, right? I think we can look at our turnover for teachers right now. And I was flabbergasted. I knew the numbers were high, but when, as Desi was before us, some of the numbers now are within 5 years, it's 50% turnover of teachers. Within 5 years, 50% of teachers are gone. So we have got to do a better job of recruiting folks into the classroom, but supporting and retaining teachers. And I think that's the problem. I think we can look at those trends and what's happening. When you're constantly with new teachers who are just trying to figure out how to practice their craft, how to really be a teacher, that takes several years. It takes several years in any job to figure out how to do your job well. And you're so overworked and have faced so many burdens that you're simply gone in a few years. And that's what I find frustrating. So I do think there's a lot into teacher pay, doing what we can to increase teacher pay. So we really are getting the best and brightest into our classrooms. And I'm not saying that we don't have some of the best and brightest in our classrooms today, but I'm saying we have to do a better job of making sure that we have new teachers entering the classroom. And once they get in the classroom, that we're supporting them. And with all of that, wraparound services that teachers really need to be successful. Now, I can also say, as a mom to a third grader who has never experienced a school year without implications of COVID, right? He left his kindergarten year in March, as we all did, and went home. There's been a lot of challenges as trying to readjust to what is normal. And so I think one of the adverse consequences of COVID was simply the loss of that social interaction. And it's hard. It's hard to be back in a classroom every day for kids who, I think the secondary students, especially, that was a hard adjustment to get back to go in every day. But I do think kids learn best in the classroom. I think kids learn best when technology is used really as a tool and not as a substitute for the teacher in the classroom. And so all of those things I think are in play today.
This open enrollment bill narrowly passed in the House. Do you expect to have much of a chance of passing in the Senate, or do you think it could run into even bipartisan opposition?
It's going to be interesting as all of those negotiations play out. And obviously, I'm not over on the Senate side, so I don't know exactly what those conversations are like today. But we do have some really good pieces of policy moving surrounding education. And so I do think there's probably going to be a time and a place for some compromises there. What are we doing more to invest in the foundation formula, specifically surrounding students? It takes more resources to educate students who are in poverty. And so I think there's some really important calculations that need to be, or modifications to the formula today that can be made for that. So we'll see. It's going to be one of those, we will wait and see. The interesting thing about this is certainly not one of those, a bipartisan or, a split party divide here. There are folks in every community, every walk of life that have concerns about open enrollment.
To change topics, the Senate has sent the House 2 bills that revolve around transgender rights. The first restricts transgender health care for minors, while the other bars student athletes from competing in a sport that aligns with their gender identity. What are your expectations for when those bills make it to the House?
Well, I think there's a lot of just nervous apprehension, anxiety surrounding this right now, how these conversations are going to go, because they haven't gone well in the past. And I hate that we are continue to really dissect kids' lives on the House floor. And there will be attack after attack against these kids. And that's some of the most painful debates that we've had on the floor have been surrounding, simply attacks on the LGBTQ community. And so I am not looking forward to those conversations. But at the same time, I can tell you that our caucus is going to stand and will continue to be allies to show the trans community specifically that we see you, that you are valued, that we care about you. And I hope that we have some room here for a little bit of negotiation too. Obviously we're stuck with what the Senate sent us right now, but man, I wish we could have it delayed. At this point, I think probably our only thing that we can do is really delay the effective date of that legislation.
You speak on negotiations. Some Republicans have criticized the Senate for putting a 4-year sunset on the gender affirming healthcare bill, as well as the trans athlete bill. It also exempts minors who are going through hormonal therapy or puberty blockers who are currently have those prescriptions. Do you think the House could make the bills more restrictive, or is the House really going to look at how long the Senate spent to get to this compromise and not want to risk it? I'm curious kind of your thoughts on whether or not the House thinks it's going to be worth to change it.
Yeah, because I think our conservative members are going to say that this didn't go far enough, right? And they're going to push for what I would say are even more egregious bans in punishing kids. I don't know. I think that I do not know how this is going to play out. So it's definitely going to be a wait and see. And unfortunately, I think that could happen as soon as next week.
It's been interesting to hear Republicans say that these two bills are major priorities for them. Their rationale is constituents want these bills. And if that's actually true, and a lot of these Republicans represent rural counties and exurban counties, what do you think needs to be done to make the LGBTQ community more welcomed in those communities?
Yeah, and I asked the folks who were sponsoring amendments, for example, last year, have you sat down with any of these families? Have you talked with them? Have you listened to their stories and their why? And over again, I heard no. And that's the part that's most disappointing, is that you're trying to legislate something out of fear and simply an unknowing. And I understand being uncomfortable with something you don't understand, but take a moment to educate yourself, take a moment to listen to their stories. And I just find it so maddening that we had more bills targeting the trans community than we had trans athletes even playing sports in this state, and how much time and state resources we've spent targeting this community is just absolutely frustrating. And it's just been a sad time for Missouri. We have real issues in the state, and that's what I would love us to be talking about. What can we do to really address the escalating gun violence in our state? What can we do to make sure that Missourians aren't flocking to other areas of the country, that they don't feel welcomed here? So anyway, we have lots of issues that we could be talking about, but yet we get stuck on these wedge issues that really are not important to the vast majority of Missourians. I would love to get back to those kitchen table topics.
So in the last couple minutes we have, I do have a couple political questions, because this is politically speaking. So there has to be some politics involved.
Go for it.
You have announced that you are running to succeed Senator Lauren Arthur in the 17th Senatorial District. Why did you decide to jump into that race, considering you could have hypothetically ran for 2 more terms in the House?
Well, I mentioned this earlier, but I really commend Lauren for just doing an outstanding job in the Senate. Obviously, there's, just been 10 Democratic senators over there, but she's carried a tremendous amount of weight on her shoulders and has done a heck of a job negotiating policy. And I recognize how important that leadership really is over there. And, as you all know, there's 163 members in the House, and it's really hard to get a lot of our priorities done as Democrats. Thankfully, I've been successful. This year I've had several bills that are getting passed out and moving along in the process, and so that's been really great. However, I recognize the impact in the Senate is obviously above and beyond. As I mentioned before, I started as an intern in the Senate, and I started as an intern on that, for Chuck Gross as he was sharing appropriations. I recognize how important the appropriations process is over there, as we fail to write the budget over here on the House side. And so I'm eager to be part of that work over on the Senate side.
The seat, I think, is, as we talked about at the beginning of the show, it's much more Democratic leaning than it was 20 years ago. And even after redistricting, I've actually talked to a couple of Republicans from Clay County. It's actually, I think, got a slightly more Democratic, but it's not overwhelmingly Democratic. So it's possible that this could be a pretty competitive race, and the Republicans could put forth a serious candidate that could raise serious money. What's kind of your expectations about how competitive this contest could be for you?
It certainly is going to be a competitive seat. It has become more Democratic. The area that was more red was kind of lobbed off into that 24th senatorial district, which is incredibly wide. And
I think
goes,
it's 21st.
The 21st, yes, 21st. So that area of the Senate district is no longer part of it. And so the district is much more Democratic leaning now. However, if there's an open Senate seat, we know that the other side is going to pour in tremendous amount of money. I think, at this time, I really am the right candidate for it. Just again, speaking to being a voice of moderation, I recognize that that's what our community wants. They want somebody and they want a leader in the Senate who's really going to be a voice for the community and focus on the issues that matter to them and not get caught up in this hyperbolic political rhetoric.
When I was talking with Missouri Democratic Party Chairman Russ Carnahan a couple weeks ago, one of the things he really harped on is this idea of kind of this team mentality, and that like whoever is running for governor should be helpful to people who are running for other statewide offices and state Senate seats. But your party doesn't have a Democratic candidate for governor right now. And I think that whoever is leading your ticket could be influential to people like you. So this is a roundabout way of saying, who do you think should run for governor for your party? And how important do you think that is going to be for candidates like yourself?
I've got to say, we have some tremendous Democratic leaders right now in the state house, and I am just in awe of the work that they're doing every day. They've really stood up and they've been that voice of reason so many times when we've gotten stuck in these ridiculous debates. And obviously, I have tremendous respect for Minority Leader Crystal Quaid. I've been just impressed with how she not only leads our caucus, but really is able to negotiate and put priorities of Missourians first. I think she would be a tremendous, not just candidate, I think she would be a tremendous first woman governor of the state of Missouri. It's a tough ask for anybody to put, so much on hold as they campaign for that seat. However, we recognize that we have to be out there. We need to make sure that we are sending a message that we are united, and we're going to stand up for Missourians.
And I guess if Representative Quaid doesn't want to run, I did a Twitter poll, I think in July, of which Missouri politician should be memed into prominence. And the winner of that was Senator Lauren Arthur. So maybe Senator Arthur, since she's can't run for the Senate anymore, could ride her memeability to the statewide office or something.
I tell you what, if she set her mind to it, I tell you what, I don't think there's anything that she couldn't accomplish.
We will leave it at that. And thank you so much for your time, Representative. We really appreciate it. Politically speaking.
Yeah, really appreciate it being on. Thank you.
You're welcome. Politically Speaking is a product of St. Louis Public Radio, which is part of the University of Missouri St. Louis. You can read all of our political coverage at stlpr.org. And Representative, where could we find you on the internet where you want to be found?
Sure. So on social media, you can find me at Maggie Nurrenbern. My website's maggieformo.com. And always you can connect me through our office here in the House. I am the only Representative Nurrenbern, so it shouldn't be hard to find.
Very good. We'll be back next time. Until then, so long.
From St. Louis Public Radio, this is Politically Speaking.
If you have a smart speaker, you have access to the entire world of NPR and St. Louis Public Radio. All the latest news and all the captivating stories. Activate our voices with yours by telling your smart speaker to play St. Louis Public Radio.